Well, hello and welcome to this Chapter Zero Climate Risk Scenario Analysis event. My name is Jo Paisley and I'm co-president of the GARP Risk Institute, and I'm delighted to be your host and narrator today. You'll see from the slide, the title slide, that the event's been put together with colleagues from Clyde & Co. And indeed, the event was very much inspired by their physical risk assessment event that was held earlier in the year when we were having in-person events. So very many thanks, particular to Nigel Brooke and Natalia Dorfman for helping us put the scenario together. So before we launch in, I want to just go through a few sort of technical bits of advice so that you get the most out of today's broadcast. So this slide gives you a few top tips. If your screen freezes, press F5. That should usually get rid of most problems. For any technical difficulties, troubleshoot by clicking on the yellow help icon. Now, any questions you have, do type them into the Q&A box. We will have questions, probably throughout, but most at the end. But do provide us with questions so that we can keep the panelists on their feet. You can download the slides by clicking on the green icon, and that could be quite helpful because there's quite a lot of information on the slides, so you might find that useful today. And finally, you can resize any of the windows by just holding down and dragging the bottom right corner. So without further ado, let's get into the rest of today. So here's the order of events. We'll start with some introductions to our panel and to Chapter Zero, and then we will set the scene for our scenario game today. Now, the way this is going to work is that you, the audience, are the board of a company, and you're going to be asked to vote on various issues related to a disorderly transition. Now, we've got a lot to get through. You can imagine we're actually going to go through 4 board meetings in about an hour, and I think that's going to be quite tough. So we will keep it moving pretty swiftly. Once you vote on an issue, there will be an outcome. And then you will have the benefit of wisdom from our incredible panel, who will give their perspective as well. And then we'll end today by having an overall kind of panel discussion with some Q&A, hopefully from the audience. So let me introduce our panel. And what a panel we have. I'm absolutely delighted. We have Julie Badley, the founder and chair of the Chapter Zero Network, and one of the UK's most experienced women directors, both across executive and non-executive roles. Nigel Brooke, partner at Clyde & Co., who leads their global campaign on resilience and climate change risk, raising awareness of the climate-related legal duties and potential liabilities. Always useful to have a lawyer around when it comes to climate change. Miriam Omi, the head of sustainability and responsible investment strategy at LG Investment Management, responsible for engaging on sustainability themes globally. And David Tyler, chair of Domestic General and White Company, with extensive experience in executive and non-executive roles across a number of different sectors. So really an amazing experience, wide range of experience that's going to help us learn as much as possible today. Now, over to you, Julie, to do a little bit of an introduction about Chapter Zero.
Thank you, Jo, and very many thanks to both GARP and to Clyde & Co. for helping put on this webinar for us. And a warm welcome from Chapter Zero to everyone on the call. Many of you are Chapter Zero members, but for those who aren't, I will just give you the headlines of what we're about. So Chapter Zero is a network of non-executive directors who are taking the climate agenda into their boardrooms. It was set up by non-execs for non-execs. It's a very business-focused network. And anyone who isn't a member, it's very, very easy to join. Please have a look at the website and join up. We have well over 1,000 members now, and more than 50% of the FTSE 100. So even the slide is slightly out of date. And we're delighted that the growth has continued right through the last 7-8 months in spite of COVID. In fact, if anything, I think COVID has increased people's interest in these big risk areas that are facing us all. We're also part of an international network, so there are 18 more chapters either launched or under development around the world, and some of our colleagues from those are on the call today. So that's a particularly exciting thing, I think, for Chapter Zero, to see the global movement growing. And what we provide is events like this one, toolkits, resources. So if we could just go to the next slide, Joe, that would be great. So I put this one up because today we launched our enhanced board toolkit. Some of you will have seen an earlier version of this, but it's now very much enlivened in that it's a line tool now with direct responses as you fill in comments about where your board is on climate. I do encourage you to download it and complete it either as an individual board member or even better with the rest of your board to compare views on where you think your companies are on this climate journey. It's a fantastic tool. And like everything else with Chapter Zero, it's free and everybody is welcome to use it. So Joe, I'll hand back to you at that point.
Great. Thanks very much. And I should explain that GARP, the Global Association of Risk Professionals, we're all about risk education and awareness. And we also see the vital importance of boards in helping firms navigate through the climate transition. So we are a huge supporter of Chapter Zero, and many congratulations, Julie, on driving such a successful launch of the network and reaching so many firms. It's great. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about the transition. Before we get into today's scenario, though, I do want to quickly set the scene. I certainly don't need to tell this audience that climate change is serious. But one of the real challenges when trying to think about it from a risk perspective, which is what we try and do at GARP, is that the future will not be like the past. And in fact, we do not know exactly what the future holds. So on this slide, you'll see three illustrative pathways, which we've taken from the Bank of England. And I think a number of you will be familiar with them. And they show you possible future pathways for policy. That's proxied by the carbon price on the left-hand chart, on emissions in the middle, and then what the resulting temperature change is on the right-hand one. And you can see there are three stylized pathways here. There's an early policy action, which is in blue, and that's where we get our act together and we enact policies that will help to reduce emissions and limit the temperature increase. There's also then a late policy action. That's more a disorderly transition. And here the policymakers are late to take action and they have to somewhat slam on the brakes. And that means that in terms of, you can see on the left-hand column, you get a steeper rise in the carbon price. In other words, things have to happen in a more abrupt way, and you don't have such a great outcome in terms of temperature increases. And then finally, there's the worst outcome in terms of the physical risks, and that's where we don't have any additional policy action, and we call that often a hothouse world. And hopefully we will curb emissions, and I'm sure that many of us are a little bit more positive than we were a few weeks ago, given recent events in America. But we don't know. And I thought to get you in the mood for voting, we try and take the audience's temperature. So I wanted to just kind of set the scene and find out which scenario you think is the most likely in real life. Do you think we will get our act together and it will be a nice, smooth, orderly transition with early policy action? And we're talking about global here. Do you think it will be a late policy action with a disorderly transition? Or do you think that we are headed for a hothouse world? And so on this slide, you can just take your time, think about those three different options, and then we'll have a look at the poll results in a minute. I should say at this point I've been told to give people enough time, but we are going to be running this event again next week for our global GARP audience as part of our 2020 Climate Risks Symposium. So in a sense, we're learning from this esteemed audience. So if you've got any feedback for me, either as we're going through or at the end on ways we can improve it, make it easier for you, or a better event, then do let me know. Okay, I think I've waffled on enough now. Shall we see what the results of the poll are? Well, that's quite good, actually, from my point of view, because guess what scenario we're doing today? We're doing the disorderly transition. And I'm not that surprised, but, you know, that's a big majority of you. Nearly 3/4 of you think that is the most likely transition. At least I'm glad that it wasn't a majority who think it's a hothouse world, because I think that would be thoroughly depressing for all of us. Anyway, when we're thinking about the financial risks from climate change, quite a useful way to start sort of putting it all together is shown in this diagram taken from the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And you will see there, it's not just about risks, it's also about opportunities. But we are going to be focusing in on these transition risks. And there are basically 4 sources. There are policy risks arising from changes in regulation and legal risks from climate-related liability. There's technology risks that's caused by emerging technologies that will challenge the current ways of doing things, of manufacturing, of energy production and transport, for example. There's market risk. Now, this means changing supply and demand and changing consumer preference, for example. So businesses are going to have to navigate this dynamic environment. And of course, there's reputational risks. So these are the factors that you, the board, will need to be thinking about in our scenario game today. So watch out for those different risk factors as we go through it. And let's now get into the scenario. Okay, so you, the audience, are the board of a hypothetical global company, our company. And you're going to be asked to vote on various issues to help steer the company through a disorderly transition to a low carbon economy. And it's really important that you do vote because that's what helps us actually navigate and we get the learnings from that. You will benefit, as I've said, from the views of our expert panel, but only after they've seen how you vote and what the outcome of that vote is. So they do have the benefit of that. Now, our company, or ARCO, has 3 main divisions. It has food and beverage and health and personal care units, and they're the main profit centres. But we also have a transport and logistics arm to help get our products to market. We're quite a big company. We employ 150,000 staff. We have an annual turnover of 60 billion. And what's not noted on here is that we have more than 1,000 suppliers. So our supply chain is a big issue for us. Just a word about carbon emissions before we get started. I'm not going to dwell on these differences much. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. I mean, this certainly isn't an accounting scenario, but you just need to be aware of the differences. So Scope 1 captures all direct emissions from the activities of an organisation under their control. In Scope 2, you have the indirect emissions from the electricity purchases that are used by, and those that are used by the firm. And Scope 3 are all the other indirect emissions arise from sources you don't control, for example, business travel and the like. And this is where companies have most of their emissions. But beware of this, because if you choose to outsource something, then it may just be moving from Scope 1 to Scope 3. So that's just something to bear in mind without giving too much away on the scenario. Right, our scenario timeline. It starts in 2021. It's a 10-year scenario. And we're going to start the first board meeting, which is in January 2021. And item number 36 is the CFO is to present the draft TCFD report. Now, the background here is that the company decided to delegate the task of writing the TCFD report a few months back. And the CFO has treated it very much as a reporting exercise. So he delegated it to his team in financial control. They've had no input, particularly from any risk specialists or strategy people. And he's just presented you with the four TCFD categories on governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. And he's not done a bad job, but he hasn't really embraced the whole spirit of TCFD. And for those of you not familiar with that, this is becoming, if you like, the standard framework for disclosures around climate-related financial risks. And certainly our CFO wasn't that familiar with all of it. Now, I would have presented you with the TCFD report itself, but of course we're going to have 4 board meetings within the hour, so we don't have time to go through it. But I can cut to the chase and I can tell you what the reaction is from the board. Well, you've not been very happy. You're pretty, you think it's pretty superficial, the scenario analysis that he has presented. You're worried about the lack of data. And just a bit of background to you is the board did have a strategy away day recently, but we couldn't actually agree on a net zero commitment, unlike many of our competitors. The publication for this TCFD report is in just 5 weeks' time, so there isn't time to go away and redo the analysis. And the other thing to bear in mind is that many of our competitors have already published pretty reasonable TCFD reports, and all our major competitors have declared ambitious net zero commitments. And by ambitious, I mean either 2045 or 2040. So what do you do? Well, this is your first vote. And we want you to think. If you were in the board and you had to make a decision, what would you do? Would you want to commit to net zero in 2050 in the annual report, in your publications, and then develop plans to deliver it afterwards? Or do you want to just publish the TCFD report and indicate in the report that you're going to declare a net zero target within the coming year? So I'm going to put the poll up. I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. And you're probably sitting there thinking, I want a lot more information, but unfortunately that's the nature of the game. You don't have all of the information. And I'm sure most board members always want more information. But this is one of those things. Do you want to be ambitious? Do you want to just go out there in the world? But have you got the credibility? So let's see. I think we should probably give you a little bit more time. Which way are you going to go? Okay, I'm going to reveal the results. Right. Okay, so just over 40% of you have voted to commit to net zero in 2050 and then develop the plans afterwards. You obviously think that it's really important to just get out there with that commitment. But more of you, nearly 60%, believe publish the TCFD report and indicate you'll declare that net zero target within the coming year. So a little bit cautious, worried about publishing without the details behind it. Well, what's the outcome then from publishing that TCFD report and indicating you're going to declare the net zero target within the coming year? Unfortunately, quite a lot of skepticism. So with no target set, we're seen as a long way behind our competitors. And there are league tables now being published externally on these targets, and many of our employees also have expressed disappointment and question whether this is a good place to work. To make matters worse, we then have an AGM in the April, and we're faced with this reaction from our shareholders. So one of our investors, ABC Asset Management, declares that Alco has failed to provide share owners with the needed information to adequately assess their climate-related objectives. They submit a resolution supported by the majority or by our major institutional investors. that the company issue a statement disclosing a target for net zero before 2050, together with an implementation plan and clear milestones. Now, at the company's AGM, that resolution passes with 53% of the vote. It is non-binding, but we've clearly got ourselves into a bit of a mess by being behind on TCFD, not getting the right staff involved in producing it, and basically not doing a very good job at the beginning of this. Let me turn it over to our panel and see what they think. And can I turn to Miriam first for her views?
Sure. I mean, I want to say, first of all, I'm not the one to judge what boards should do. That's what you do. But I want to give a little bit of a context from an investor perspective on net zero targets and the kind of expectations that investors are increasingly having on companies and reports. So first of all, the net zero pressure is also on investors right now. For us to be net zero asset manager, for us to create net zero portfolios and so forth. So that's really coming throughout the whole economy, and that would have implications in the way that we vote. There's a lot of pressure on investors to start to hold companies accountable on climate targets. Now, this is a very prescriptive, sort of ambitious target, but there are many, many things that we have started to vote on. So I think one thing I can say is that the pressure is on, it's only going to increase from investors' perspective. Having said that, obviously the targets have to be meaningful. And so there is a difference between, an ambition with the substance and something that we can get our teeth into. So what we're looking for more and more is what's in the annual report and supplementary reports like TCFD, which should be, by the way, in the annual report. So it really requires companies to put a team together and think through the implications in terms of strategy and so forth. And where we start to hold companies accountable over and above shareholder resolution is obviously the chair of the board, but also chair of the remuneration board in terms of how the executive pay is starting to be linked into strategy like this. Chair of the audit committee, how are the risks of climate, whether transition or physical, are incorporated into the business plans, and are they accountable? Chair of the nomination committee. What kind of board members do you have? Do you have the right skill set and background to think through the implications of this tremendous transformations that we have to go through? So this is more than just a question of shareholder resolution. It's really about strategy and people and business and so forth. And then one last thing to say is that Mark Carney, who was the former governor of Bank of England, who's now leading the climate finance role for COP26, he just made an announcement saying that we should have an annual vote by investors on climate strategy. So again, I think this is starting to become a lot more mainstream for investors to start to have a say on net zero targets. So I would say that the delaying tactic doesn't quite work anymore, although I am for the idea of that, you actually give it yourself 1 year to think about what the plan is and publish something substantial rather than meaningless aspirational target.
Thanks a lot, Miriam. And how about you, David? Can you give your perspective, please?
Well, thanks, Jo. If I can start by saying, effectively this board's got itself into a little bit of a tricky position, because it seems to me it's been a little bit slow. And in part of your introduction, you said that they couldn't come to a decision. On the last occasion, they talked about it. So it's now got a dilemma, because it's got to deal to some extent with a damage limitation exercise. But many companies are in this position. This is not unusual. And there are clearly trade-offs here between the two different solutions. And I'm quite interested to hear the vote, being less than 60-40, one way or the other. And it's understandable that people can easily vote either way. If you go too slow on this whole track, you clearly are going to have a detrimental impact on certain stakeholders, maybe your consumers, or maybe a selection of your consumers. And a lot of your consumers, of course, may be other companies who, because you're B2B as well as B2C, as I understand it, in this company. and the other companies may have their own requirements. So firstly, you may, if you're too slow, be having a detrimental impact on them. And secondly, on your own employees. I mean, the commitment, particularly of people, younger people, is very clear. They don't really want to work for a laggard, a backmarker in this area. You know, you may find, especially if your competitors have moved, and this is what the scenario here is, you're going to be in some difficulty there. So that pushes you, you know, to get on with it. On the other hand, if you go too fast, I think you may find that the costs of achieving a tough target may just simply be too high. You may spend a lot of money on things that don't work out. You'll use a lot of cash. And it may be in the markets you're operating in, with your cost levels higher, other companies who aren't tackling it so vigorously may undercut you, leading to a lack of competitiveness. So it's not easy. It's not obvious which way to go. My gut reaction, though, given where we now are, and we're in 2021, I think, in this example, is to set a target for net zero, at least in line with peers. You don't think you have to be ahead of peers. For 2040, 2045, it's a reasonable base, I think, for most companies to be thinking that is a reasonable net zero target. And above all, I think you need to set some interim targets as well very soon, with action plans to achieve them. Otherwise, it probably won't be very meaningful to any of your audiences. And investors will be certainly looking for those, and I suspect well clued up employees will be as well. And what I would say, certainly my experience, is these things do take a long time, so you want to get on with it. At Sainsbury's, which I chaired for a decade until last year, we set out targets in 2010 for where we wanted to get to in 2020 in terms of changing our supply chain, making it more sustainable, thinking about moving towards using a lot less carbon and so on. And it does take a long time to adjust because you've got so many people in that chain. So my overall message is whichever you choose here, please get on with it.
That's a great message, and it's probably going to be a theme for today, actually. Nigel, any of our thoughts from a legal point of view?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to say TCFD from a stunning start, it was only published for the first time in 2017 as a standard. It's now rapidly become the gold standard around the world. And the UK in particular is taking a lead here. So already some months ago, the government had floated the idea of listed companies have to comply with TCFD or explain why not by 2022. As of Monday, they've declared a more ambitious timetable where a wider range of companies will have to comply. And most companies in the UK, they think, will be complying by 2023, and the backstop is 2025. So this and other countries will follow along this route. Picking up David's point, this takes time. TCFD is not a box-ticking process. It's not just about reporting. Of course, it's about having identified climate risk, also then working out and then explaining what you're going to do about it. And there's the ratchets built into that. Of course, the more you report and the more your peers report, the more points of comparison your investors and other stakeholders have. So there's just going to be increasing pressure to get this right. And of course, surrounding this, there's the legal duties on the board. And the existing duties of care, straight out of the textbook, applied to the changing circumstances of climate risk, will create new duties here. Duties of under-reporting or over-reporting. For example, that if you overstated your green credentials in your TCFD reporting, that could expose you. So this is going to be a challenging area, and it's going to be a fast-moving one as well. With some companies facing a deadline by as early as 2022 and others not far off that, they really need to get on with this.
Oops. The board has listened to the wisdom of the panel, and we've decided, after an extraordinary board meeting, they agree to set up a transformational project, creatively named Project Transform, which will receive an initial £300 million budget clear milestones are established, and a pathway for emissions reductions to reach net zero by 2040. So we've decided from being a bit of a laggard to trying to be a bit of a leader. And this is the press release that we put out in June. So now let's move on with the scenario. We're looking at the years between 2021 and the next major event. Well, what happens is COP26 in November 2021 actually ends without international agreement. The COVID-19 pandemic, I'm afraid, gets a lot worse before it gets better. That affects the sales of our beauty lines in particular. And over the intervening years, political pressure to meet net zero wanes. We continue to work on our plans, but we do quietly deprioritise Project Transform internally. And look at that, incredible animation, no expense spared here. We now arrive in January 2026 after an incredibly hot summer in 2025, where the physical realities of a warming planet are unfortunately all too apparent. And that's followed by a winter of flooding and storms. So the board meets in January 2026. And this is where we're going to discuss an update from the Project Transform team. It's quietly actually moving up the agenda. Now it's agenda item number 24, where our team has been thinking about investing in hydrogen technology for our transport and logistics business. But first of all, the team are going to give us a update on the climate policy context, which has begun to heat up a bit. Excuse the pun. So suddenly a lot is going on in the climate space, and note that this is disorderly. That's the nature of a disorderly scenario. Things take a while to get going. So COP30 in November 2025 results in renewed international cooperation and ambition. There's a major IPCC report which depressingly finds that a 6-degree warming world is deemed more likely than a 1.5 warming world. There's rumours of a global carbon tax of between $150 and $250 per tonne. And the UK government, it is clear, will fail to reach their target of cutting emissions by 50% by 2030. A new UK Labour government has come in with renewed ambition. And in terms of our own Project Transform, well, the project overall is running at amber. And that's because we missed many of those early milestones. And some of those were because COVID-19 related expenditures were prioritised, but also because the climate policy environment was weak. And although we've got many achievements, the reduction in emissions across our business lines is lower than we had set ourselves in our benchmark. Scope 3 carbon emissions still remain a real challenge. So the team update us, and they note that the quickest way to get us back onto green is to cut emissions rapidly, and they think the main area to explore is our transportation and logistics business. Now, this is where we get to some technology options. We'd received a report on the future of hydrogen power from some leading consultants, and that report was very exciting. It noted how the total cost of ownership of hydrogen fuel cell was expected to fall rapidly over the next 5 years, and the likelihood of success was deemed a lot higher than it had been. Now, the Project Transform team argue this is a great opportunity for ARCO to become state-of-the-art distribution company, as other companies also need to reduce their footprint. So in other words, we can start making this a profit centre in itself. If we do invest in that technology, then we will still have diesel emissions on our books for many years from our existing fleet. But the board also needs to consider the opportunity cost, because we could divest the distribution and business and raise capital for other projects. And we know that there are buyers out there for our diesel fleet now, so we could actually get some money in. So the vote that we're going to ask you to think about now is, what do you want to do about this distribution business? Do you want to sell the distribution business that we have and outsource the function? We sell it to the most competitive, we outsource to the most competitive provider, and we hope that they move to a more carbon neutral vehicle fleet soon. Or do you want to be innovative and you want to invest heavily towards building a hydrogen-powered green fleet, even though the technology hasn't been completely proven yet? So that's the dilemma I'm going to put to you. And here are the voting buttons. So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to think about it. And just bear in mind that, as I said, technological changes are one aspect of the transition to a low carbon economy, one of those risk factors that we noted in the TCFD diagram earlier. And certainly the team seem very excited about it, but you, the wise board with steady heads, are really thinking about our capability to manage this technology. You're thinking about the risks, you're thinking about the opportunities, all those things that board members would always be considering when you've got a major issue like this. So we're slowly, I can see more and more people, they're actually voting. You're thinking deeply about this. You're probably thinking, I need a lot more financial information before I can possibly make a vote on this. But unfortunately, that's the nature of the scenario. We've got a few more coming in. I'm going to give you a bit more time. And then I'm going to go through what the outcome is. So how innovative are you as a board? Well, let's take a look. Right. So you're a risk-loving lot. You're going to invest heavily towards hydrogen, even though the technology is not proven yet. Well, the outcome from this, let me just move on. I'm actually going to give you a bit of an idea of the outcome from both, because I want the panel to comment on the range of options here. So had you voted to sell the distribution business, the most competitive buyer was actually a private equity firm with few environmental standards that was intending to continue to run the carbon-intensive fleet. We would have still had to lease the diesel vehicles, so our emissions would have moved from scope 1 to scope 3. So that's the outcome from number one. That wasn't as green as investing in hydrogen. And actually, we win praise for investing in this. Our shareholders recognise there's little other option in the near term. We do a good job at educating our stakeholders about the superficial attraction of selling the fleet. And we emphasise that we are in this for the long term. So let me turn to the panel and let's see what they have to say about it. David, could you go first?
I got the short straw, did I? Thank you very much, Jo. Well, yes, of course, as you've already said, we don't have enough information to make a serious board decision. But what should we be thinking about? Well, firstly, just returning to the words you used on option one, which was selling the distribution business. The word that leapt out at me was hoping. Goodness, hoping that the buyer, I'm just reading it, would move to more carbon neutral vehicles soon. Well, clearly, no board which is responsible and wants to be responsible for moving towards net zero is going to just simply hope someone does it. I think this is a credible option, provided you've got a really well worked out contract with the other party, where you know and you feel that they've got credibility in actually moving in that net zero direction and reducing carbon. They may have a lot more expertise than you. Possibly the PE company you're talking about here, Jo, hasn't got that expertise, but you want to know all of that. And also, of course, just thinking of the other side of the equation, the economics for the company, you'd want to know that the price was going to be reasonable. Otherwise, you are going to be uncompetitive again. So you'll want to make sure that you've got ongoing competitive power and leverage in what you pay year by year to this company if you've outsourced it to it for the service. Otherwise, you could be put out of business in this area by just being too expensive. But I think in the right way, it is obviously a credible option, albeit it only reduces your overall impact, as you say, because it's going from scope 1 to scope 3. if the people who are outsourcing it to have real expertise, maybe scale economies in this area or whatever, to allow them to do it better than you. Now, I think we'd all love to do option 2, and it was interesting to see the big majority for that in this group. But let's face it, let me just put the counter argument for a moment. Look, it's a big bet. And of course, as you've just said, Joe, a lot of investors might applaud it because they'd love to see this succeed. But you as a management team, you as a board, how are you all going to feel in a couple of years' time, in, let's say, 2028, when you have to announce that the whole project was a disaster, it didn't work, you've had to write off a lot of money? What's that going to do to your relationship with your investors? And indeed, what credibility you're going to have with other stakeholders, including your own employees, consumers, and so on. So it is a big bet. And I'm sure all of us were saying when we tick that box, it depends on the quality of the analysis. And no doubt the company will have done a lot of careful analysis before it made this choice in 2026, if it did. And I have to say, one of the obvious things it might want to do is to partner with other people, because this isn't just a one-off technology that we're looking at in our co. I'm sure a lot of other people will be doing so too, and we'd all be working together on it to reduce risk. So I will pass back to you, Joe.
Thanks a lot, David. No, that's very useful insights. And I suspect that part of the reason this audience voted for that is because some of the optimism of Julie Baddeley has rubbed off on them, and the ambition. So let's hear from Julie.
Thanks, Joe. Well, yes. I mean, I think what I am very excited and optimistic about is just generally the innovation that's going on. And so, I'm not in any way qualified to judge hydrogen as a long-term solution for powering vehicles, although there seems to be some quite good stories out there about it. But generally, the innovation that is coming into this space across all aspects of business is fantastic. And that gives boards quite serious dilemmas, because some of it is expensive and it is unproven. But equally, I do think that some of these innovative solutions are going to have to be our way out of some of the issues, because we can't reduce emissions by just doing less. We cannot just reduce demand for things. That's not a way to grow ourselves out of this problem. So we're going to need technology, and we're going to need innovation to help tackle this issue. And I think there's some very exciting stuff out there. And I'm just quite glad I'm not on the board of a car company at the moment, having to think about electric vehicles, because, Volkswagen, I'm told, has spent 100 billion on coming up with the electric vehicles. And if somebody suddenly shows that you can power consumer vehicles with hydrogen, it might look a bit sad, but, we've got to go with these opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Miriam, any thoughts from you on this dilemma?
Just to give a little bit of context around how investors might kind of see this opportunity risk. So far, the investments funds have focused on scope 1 and 2. So as long as you can kind of shift it onto scope 3, maybe it wasn't such a big deal. What's happening now is there's a huge amount of pressure on investors to look at scope 3. So the point about, it's okay because we just sell it off and we get a third party to do it, it's going to increasingly become accountable even for the firm. So that's something really to think about, kind of the development of scope 3 mapping and holding companies accountable for that. Another thing that I think is really important, and I think David said, is like, this is where really collaboration becomes really important. Like, you can't solve this by yourself, no matter how good the board is. So we'll be looking at what kind of sector-wide collaborations that you might be able to be part of, whether it be sort of transport sector or distribution. That's one thing that, again, we started to collect information on, what platforms you're part of. And on the back of that, also lobbying, which is sort of a swear word for many people. But this needs support by the government in terms of infrastructure, in terms of maybe R&D, maybe even carbon prices. So again, how are you engaging with the governments, trade association? Again, investors like us are starting to get information on that. So if you're part of lobbying kind of trade association group that is not helping the development of hydrogen, green hydrogen, just to be clear, not blue or gray, and supporting this kind of development, I think kind of brownie points for that as well. And the very last thing I want to say is that you might be able to also launch green bonds. And so you kind of try to maybe attract investors by collecting interest that way and then issuing a green version of your bonds. So I think there are some innovations that could be leveraged as part of this. I'm not saying that you should go into hydrogen. No, that's not for me to make a call. But I think, you know, we have to look holistically about how to attract capital to be able to invest in this technology that might be needed for the future of the business.
Collaboration is definitely a theme that we emphasise at GARP. Given the urgency of tackling this, the need to collaborate across different disciplines and different bodies is absolutely critical. Okay, in the interest of time, I think we'll press on. The board has a busy agenda, and here we go. So we are, let me press this, just to show you where we're heading towards. 2029. My goodness, the years are flashing past. And the board is now going to be looking at the supply chain. As you said, Miriam, this is a key issue. So we have a board meeting in November 2029. And you'll see, for those of you, the sharp-eyed, it's moving up the agenda. It's item number 17 now. And we're going to be looking at the issue of our suppliers. And this update will be focused on one of our key suppliers in India. But first of all, the board receives an update on the Project Transform status. And at the moment, the project is overall, it's running at amber still. We have cut our emissions by about a third since 2021, but that's not at the benchmark, which was over 40% we should have done by now. And on the climate policy front, well, a global carbon tax of $200 per tonne has just been announced to come into effect next year. And that will affect our costs and those of our others, of course. But it's given us an extra impetus to cut emissions. And looking at our supply chain emissions more seriously, we realise that to meet net zero in our supply chain, we're going to have to review all of our suppliers. And our main supplier for our beauty products, based in India, hasn't met our environmental standards, our emission standards. Now, this is very sensitive as we're a big employer in that locality, an area which still suffers from multiple social problems, such as poor sanitation and low levels of educational attainment. So the question we have to pose ourselves is, are we going to reappoint the contract for that supplier? And this is going to be your third vote. Are we going to vote to reappoint them? And yes, because we recognise the need to take seriously our responsibilities to the local workers in India, or no, because we have a great track record of cutting emissions and we don't want to jeopardise this. And we see this actually as the way to get us back on track. So there's the vote for you. Vote number 3. What are you going to do? How are you going to balance your wider social responsibilities against your responsibilities to actually keep on track or get back on track for cutting emissions? And this brings in that more, in a sense, this part of the scenario is about that broader context. How do you balance these multiple responsibilities that you, the board, have? And it is very sensitive. And when we think about it at GARP, we often think about sustainability and climate risk, because climate risk itself is within that broader context. And that's where so many of the different dilemmas the boards will have to face come into play, trying to wrestle these multiple objectives. Let me see how many of you, yeah, a few of you still thinking hard about this. Although this is one of those ones which I'm really looking forward to seeing how the GARP global audience votes relative to people who actually know what they're talking about in terms of being on a board. I'm going to give you a few more, well, another minute or so, just to see. Let's see what type of company you really want us to be. And this is where, of course, if you have clear purpose and clear values, it's going to help you, guide you in these kind of dilemmas. Right. I think I'm going to reveal the answers. Let's have a look. Okay, so over 60% of you do want to reappoint the supplier. So you're going to prioritise those wider responsibilities relative to just under 40% of you who focused really on getting the emissions down as quickly as possible. So what is the outcome for this? Well, either one actually wasn't brilliant. We're branded hypocrites for not following our Project Transform strategy. And our reputation, unfortunately, hits an all-time low and consumer sentiment decreases further. The thing is, actually, it's not a great outcome either way, because if we didn't reappoint them, we'd have protests locally from the workers in Delhi, and we would either way be forced to spend a significant time at the board engaging in discussions on reputational rehabilitation. And either way, we incur a significant PR bill. Now, let's turn to our panel to get their take on it. And I'm going to go to David, I think. Why not? Put him in the hot seat again.
Oh, you're very generous, aren't you? Well, this is where the rubber hits the road, as you say, when you've got to make a very unpalatable choice. You don't really want to do either, but there's a trade-off here. And frankly, we haven't got enough information. Again, you are tough question master, Joe. Look, for me, the key issue is what's going on at that Indian supplier. Why hasn't it met our environmental standards? Is it our fault because we haven't spelled it out properly in the contract, haven't supervised it properly? Or is it their fault because they're all set out properly, but for one reason or another, maybe associated with their own profitability, they've just ignored it, knowing that they can strong-arm us possibly into retaining the contract for them because we'd be concerned about our reputation in India and so on. What is the reason? Perhaps they are trying extremely hard and they've just had a misfortune or two on the way. And perhaps if we understood this and we could see quickly how we could get them back on course, and we see they're motivated to do so, I would certainly have some significant sympathy in reappointing them, and that's what the majority of people on this session are saying. But we don't really know. Maybe the management of the company, maybe the ownership of the company is being devious, and I would have a very different view in those sort of circumstances. And look, if I'm stepping back and being pretty hard-nosed here, if we don't tackle successfully climate change, there won't be any Indian suppliers because there won't be a world which can operate in a global way, giving Indian suppliers global work. So unless we get the underlying issue of climate under control, there's not much a future for them in any case. That's the hard-nosed view. So I'm sorry again not to come with an absolute answer here. It depends on circumstances. And I want to also look very closely, as I've suggested here, into our own practice and whether we're responsible for some of these shortcomings too. So I'd be out and doing that. And if, as a board member, all of that wasn't clearly in front of me when presented with this decision, I'd really be concerned. Back to you.
Yeah, good points there. Thanks, David. Let's hear from the lawyer. Are there any legal issues here, Nigel, that we need to think about?
I think there are. So obviously we haven't been told what were the terms of the contract with the Indian supplier. Did they have climate environmental commitments firmly embedded in them, or were they just guidelines? And given the company's ambitions, these should be binding commitments on its suppliers. So when these contracts come in for renewal, that should be added in. And in fact, of course, we're focused today on climate change, but you may be thinking more broadly about your ESG criteria, in which case, of course, you'd also want local employment and treatment of work and so on taken into account. But that's by the by. Certainly when this company is reappointed, that might be an opportunity then to upgrade the contract, to say, if you want to keep it, these are the new terms, and you will get your house in order within a set period. So to take advantage of that. One of the earlier dilemmas about the outsourcing to the PE companies, same point arises. Could you actually impose terms under that contract which would oblige them to make a switch to greener transport? Contracts are powerful instruments, and in fact, just recently we took part in a project with Chancery Lane where we had a hackathon to draft a whole bunch of contract terms you can just drop in to a variety of contracts and address these issues. So there's a lot of imaginative solutions out there.
Excellent, thank you. Julie, what's your perspective on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just 2 points I would make. The first is just to emphasize yet again the importance of supply chain in all of this. I mean, there was a very interesting article in the FT about a month ago which said big business isn't really the problem, and the theme of it was that it's not actually big business per se, it's all those thousands of suppliers that are sort of in that emissions process. And someone like Unilever, who have 2,300, they have a project called Project Gigaton, which is specifically designed to get those suppliers properly online with the Unilever targets. I think it's just such an important area. And my experience on boards is that boards are often not all that aware of exactly what the supply chain looks like and where the weak points are and where the places are that we should be pushing these sorts of issues. The other point I would make is this isn't just about India. This is a much bigger issue for companies, I think, in terms of what the job implications are for their net zero strategies and their green agenda. A lot of these projects will involve changes in employment practices or changes in skill requirements. And that's not just in India, it could just as easily be in the northeast of England. So I think actually understanding really what those milestones are going to be in terms of delivering a strategy and getting organizational commitment to that strategy is something that quite a lot of our companies, even if they've set an ambition, we haven't really got their heads around exactly what those implications are going to be. So thinking that employment piece through generally, because once people realize some of these implications, we don't get it right, there could be quite severe disruption to our businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this one is a thorny one, and I'd like actually to turn to Miriam as well to give us the investor view as well, because the supply chain is such a difficult issue for companies to deal with.
Yeah, and I think I'm only going to echo most of what's been said, but I think the times when you could just sort of farm out your problems to Asia is nearly gone. It's not quite gone yet. And what I mean by that is, you know, we sort of say, oh, well, China and India, that's where the emissions are. Well, that's because we kind of ship the emissions over there, right? And so I think with more data available to investors, as I said earlier, scope 3, what's happening in your supply chain will be accountable to the board that's based in the UK. And, you know, with social media and other types of kind of data points that we can collect, we will be holding a lot of companies accountable for their global operations. And this whole, whether we call it just transition or the social piece has become really to the fore in face of the pandemic. It matters what happens to people or what has happened, what can be done by people. Climate cannot be seen separate from the people and employees. So again, I think there's a lot more pressures on investors and the companies overall. What are the implications for people? And to that last thing I want to say about the employee is, sometimes those net zero targets are done at the top level of the board. You get a consultant in, you got a beautiful presentation, but what's happening really on the ground, and maybe people in India may have had a fantastic idea that they could have brought themselves. So it's like, how do you create a holistic culture that bring all the innovations and ideas from the bottom up and in different regions? I think that's not something that a lot of companies have really thought about through their supply chain, but I think we need to start to do that. And so I think there is definitely a lot more pressure to think about the bits that are just being farmed out and then put it into the fore of strategy making for companies, and definitely announce that to the investors going forward.
Thanks a lot, Miriam. Yeah, a range of views there, just trying to show the board, I think, how complicated this is and how many different stakeholders you're going to need to think about. So now we come to our last board meeting, and we are now in November 2030. And for those of you paying even closer attention, Project Transform items are now really getting up the agenda of the board. It's now at item 6, up from number 36 at the beginning. So there is some progress here. And we're beginning to get now a series of new regulations hitting us. And at this board meeting, we're going to be talking about some new product carbon labelling requirements. But first of all, we're going to get the usual Project Transform update from the team. So we're still running at amber. We haven't made it to green yet. We've cut our emissions by 37%, but we were hoping to be nearer to 50% by now. And the government's introduced these compulsory product carbon labelling requirements that are coming in the next couple of years. And our data shows us that for 40% of our products, we're nowhere near on track to even have the data. So we need to kind of take some difficult decisions here. We will have to get, if we have to get the data, that requires significant new investment in data gathering. And there are some difficult choices on product range as well. So we're going to turn to you, the board, again for another vote. And here we are. What are we going to do about this product carbon footprinting data? Are we going to be leaders or laggards? That's a little bit loaded, isn't it? But are we going to plan to remove the products that are unlikely to reach our target of net zero across our product range? That would reduce consumer choice, but it hits our Project Transform carbon milestones. Or are we going to rapidly accelerate our work on reducing the carbon footprint of the whole product set, even though it will significantly increase the cost of production? So that's the dilemma you've got. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about this. I'm sure that once again, you probably feel this is irritating because I don't have enough information. But on the other hand, you've done pretty well because this is the 4th board meeting that you've had, and we're only at the hour. So well done for keeping up and keeping the voting going. And I think one of the things that I learned from putting this scenario together, with the benefit of the input from not only Clyde and Co, but also from Julie in particular, and all of the panelists actually, was just the range of issues you have to think about, the complexities, the interconnections, and some of the risks we're talking about here. They're not sort of just one risk, they're multiple risks as well. You've got reputational hits potentially, you've got legal risks, you've got technology risks, and here, potentially consumer sentiment as well. Do we even know how consumers would react to any of this? Okay, let's just see how the voting's going. Not too bad. We're getting good votes in. Okay, so what kind of board are you going to be? Are you going to remove the products, reducing consumer choice, but getting to our project transform milestones, or are we going to rapidly accelerate our work and get the data? Here we go. It's a bit more even, this one. So a majority want to rapidly accelerate the work on reducing carbon footprint of the whole product set. You are extremely ambitious. The Julie Baddeley effect has rubbed off on many of you. But some of you think it's better to actually just remove the products that won't reach our target, our internal target. So I think we're going to hear from the panelists, but in terms of the outcome, you can see from this green-looking new kind of design from our advertising consulting. Had we voted to reduce the product set with less choice, then we would have backed that up by a strong advertising campaign promoting our green credentials. And for food, we would have invested in selling more local products to reduce distribution emissions, and we'd have turned it into a positive. With vote 2, that leads to unsustainable cost increases by trying to do everything. And we are actually forced to cut our health and beauty product lines in the end more abruptly than we would have done had we decided to be a bit more proactive about this. I don't think there's necessarily a right answer here, but I'm dying to hear what the panel makes of it. So just because you've enjoyed it so much, David, I'm going to turn to you for your views.
Well, I'll try and get it wrong again, Jo. But look, here we have a fairly typical trade-off between cutting carbon and possibly profit. And, I think the company at this point is obviously committed to reduce carbon. But if we actually cut the number of products, we may find ourselves just simply uncompetitive because consumers, when they go out and buy food, go out and buy beauty products, want to have a wide range. And if we're not offering that wide range, they simply may not visit us, whether in a retail environment, whether online or wherever it happens to be. So you could operate the first option, but you might find that simply you're cutting your throat because other people and your competitors gave a better product range. Certainly that's my experience in most consumer-related businesses. It's not just the individual product people come for, it's the authority you've got offering, good, better, best as a typical example, and offering different options. If you can imagine someone selling meat in future, there's a great deal of difference between carbon requirements, carbon use between chicken, beef, pork, and so on. And you'd be thinking quite a lot about that. But if you're out of, say, beef, which is not great in terms of carbon, that might impact your sales of other products. You may be willing to do that, but you'll want to look very carefully at that sort of thing. So that's, you may well want to do that, but that's the risk you'd have to think about very, very carefully. And maybe you can do a deal with another company to provide some of the products that you're no longer producing because that company is better advanced on carbon in those particular areas. On the other hand, if we do follow the second one, reducing carbon right across the whole product set and not reducing, we just simply might find that incredibly expensive, and we may not be able to deal with it. And it might actually impact our profitability very significantly. And then I have to say, it depends on what everybody else is doing. And I haven't used the expression yet, a level playing field. Look, if we do have a level playing field, everybody around the world, from China to the United States, developed and undeveloped, less developed countries, are all operating to the same standards. Things should work out because everybody is competing on that same basis. But if we don't have a level playing field, the market is going to bifurcate. There'll be two parts to that market. Some, with players like probably Arco here being in the low carbon operating areas, but others prepared still to put up with high carbon because they're looking at a consumer who maybe is just worried about how he or she gets to the end of the week in terms of what they spend. And if there's any way they can find cheaper products, particularly for food, they will go ahead with it. So if you don't have a level playing field, things will be very different. So I don't know what that scenario is. We haven't explored that, but that's an interesting one for further Q&A, I guess, later in this session. Thanks, Jo.
Absolutely. And Julie, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I think the level playing field question is an interesting one because in our disorderly scenario, suddenly globally, $150 to $250 carbon price was imposed. And I'm by no means expert enough to really understand quite what that would mean for our co. But I do think that these sort of scenarios which companies, back to TCFD to an extent, the scenarios that companies need to be playing out for their boards, which test out the implications of different carbon prices, might come up with some surprising results on these sorts of issues. Because it may be that it's not going to be more expensive to be cheaper to be high carbon if there's a high carbon price that's being applied. The other thing I would say is I dare any marketing expert to predict what consumer behavior is going to look like in 10 years' time. I mean, if we just step back for a moment and we remember that today's children at school primary school children will be teenagers. They'll be buying lots of fashion maybe and maybe cosmetics. Today's teenagers will be in their 20s. Purchasing power will have moved through the generations a bit. And I just wonder what those groups are going to be looking for in terms of the things that they buy and the way they make their purchasing decisions. Because it may be that it's going to be very, very different from the way it is today. And they will put a lot more value on green choices, maybe even if it does mean less choice. But green might become a much more desirable thing for them. And I think 10 years out, if we follow the trends, that could be quite an interesting thing for boards to consider.
Yeah. Yeah. And Miriam, do you think that there's opportunities for Alco to turn this into a positive?
If you know now what would happen then, yes. But by then, you would have been pretty deep into a lot of mess. And I should think that the competition would be so hot in all those different areas. So, of course, you can, but you might be a target of some kind of takeover, or some of the business might have to be spun off. Because I think that diversification is good, but when you have so many different business lines and you're trying to do decarbonization and transport and cosmetics, it's difficult to do all of that in one go because there's this huge amount of investments that you have to do. And so I think instead of maybe giving advice on, sort of however many years on from now, if you can think through now what the implications are for net zero, then you might have to cut some losses now and really focus on the ones that you can excel at, because it will be very, very difficult to excel at everything. So I'm sorry, it's not positive. But we might be asking for a new CEO and new board if it's not quite happening.
No, fair enough. And I'm going to just move now to kind of just a wrap up, if you like, and take some questions and get the panelists to kind of reflect overall on kind of how they found today's scenario event. It's the first time we've done something like this, so we learn. And this, of course, was our scenario. We started in 2021. We were behind the curve almost immediately. Our first TCFD report was inadequate, and we were criticised severely for not being ambitious enough. Then we tried to get back on track by announcing Project Transform. Then, of course, the policy environment lost focus and international agreement wasn't forthcoming. So we had to then weigh up the pros and cons of retaining our transport business and investing in hydrogen. And you showed yourself to be an innovative board. We ran into these broader societal issues related to a just transition with our decision about whether to divest or not from our Indian supplier. And then we were hit by new consumer labelling requirements and the need to move the product set to net zero. So a lot has happened over these years. And I'm going to have a look at some Q&A from the audience, but just any initial kind of reactions from the panelists on whether you found that a sort of realistic scenario, yes, just general thoughts. And I'm going to start with you, Nigel.
Thinking back on the physical risk scenario we played out in February, and we played that out over a much longer time, I do think the transition, the energy transition, is going to be a lot more rapid than people expect. So I think the 10-year timescale we've been talking about here is entirely realistic. I do think that this is going to be a testing time for boards. There are going to be new risks and new opportunities coming at you fast. And preparation is going to be key here. So I think this is where real full-blooded adoption of TCFD could be enormously helpful. But moving beyond treating it as a burden, as a compliance issue, and actually embracing it and letting it seep into the board's thinking and then into the operational level as well, influencing day-to-day decisions, not just the strategic ones. I think that would much better place a company to write decisions when opportunities and risks come up. You'll have a prepared mind. And there are obviously legal risks around that as well, but I think that would be the big takeaway for me.
Brilliant. I'm just seeing we've got sort of a lot of questions, so I'm going to throw a few questions at you as the group. So one, almost like a comment here, is: would a diverse board with a capacity for climate change trigger earlier actions for this board? The board didn't appear proactive. That's actually more of a comment, really, on than a question. But I guess that it does point to the need for diversity. And Julie, with your perspective, I mean, do you have any views on the types of skills that boards would need to get to be able to manage a transition like this?
I mean, I think that diversity is always helpful, particularly when you're dealing with a situation which has ambiguities in it, which this does. I mean, people say the one certainty we do have is that climate change is happening, and that is true. But the transition you illustrated at the beginning, those different scenarios are very, very different from the point of view of the board challenge. So I think that an open-mindedness is going to be very, very important for board members. And we need all the skill sets that we can bring to bear on this. And that probably means tapping in extremely effectively also into the whole workforce and their views, the employees' views, as well as the sort of experts that we can bring in to help us from outside. I mean, I've been on boards for years, and I have no doubt that this climate issue is the most complex thing I have had to deal with. It probably sounds a bit trite to say it, but, you know, I was on boards through the financial crisis, and it was nothing to this in terms of the need to understand a very wide range of issues and to really ask a lot of probing questions. It's about asking the right questions. So provided the board is diverse and has the understanding and the competence to ask those questions, I think they will be very well placed.
Got an interesting question here. Would shifting and I'm going to ask Mariam, this one. Would shifting emission obligations to the third party for scope 3, in other words, moving it from scope 1 to scope 3, would that be considered greenwashing from a kind of investor point of view?
I'm not sure if investors would see that as greenwashing per se, if it made financial sense as a business. But what I was trying to say earlier is a shifting into scope 3 these days, or at least going forward, will not make you escape from responsibility anymore, because we are starting to invest on the back of Scope 3 data. So greenwashing is something you probably have to face from your general stakeholders. What we will be seeing is an actual number of emissions in your Scope 3. And if that's high, it doesn't matter what you say in your PR.
Yeah, yeah. There's a few comments as well from the questions, quite interesting. A question that reporting has to be the second step to setting your strategy first. And I think that's something that this company, has been behind the scene, behind in terms of its strategy. And it's almost like the reporting is the tail wagging the dog. It was the one that made them wake up. And that was one of the learnings for me. In terms of other questions, just having a look here. There's some people agreeing with Nigel. Good for you, Nigel. Another interesting one. Given that Scope 3 is the future, does the panel see that the overseas outsourcing pattern of the last 30 years will revert to in-continent production with low carbon transport? And I'm going to give that one to David.
Yeah, there are pressures which are now sort of, if you like, anti-globalization, or reverse of what we've all been doing for the last 30 years of my career, if you like. And COVID is one, which is pushing us in that direction. And certainly carbon is another. And resilience is ever more important, and sustainability in our minds, rather than just minimizing total cost, which ideally is what you get from globalization. So the question is, will those thoughts convert to reality in the years ahead? And if you like, let me come back to the central dilemma here, which is, I've just very gently touched on a few times in answer to these questions. Essentially, it's we have obligations as boards to our shareholders to create sustainable value over, the medium and long term. In other words, to maximize our profit, provided it's sustainable and its profit growth over the future. Naturally, we should take account of all of the issues of global warming. And the question now is, are companies going to move from broadly, if I want to be really tough and cynical, virtue signaling in a lot of the time, to really making decisions that are going to cost money, reduce their return on capital, reduce EPS, and so on. And then that's got a lot to do with investors, and what Miriam says is really important here. But in the final analysis, if you've got 3 alternative ways of investing in, say, the fast-moving consumer goods or whatever, and company A certainly talks a good game and seems to be doing a good job on carbon, if they are not improving their profits at the rate of company B and company C, is their share price going to hold up or not? And what value in the final analysis are investors going to put on that? This is the central dilemma you're looking at when you're sitting down around a board table dealing with these sorts of pressures on you to look after the bottom line and the future value of the share of the business and its share price against what you regard as really important obligations for global, to do your bit, for climate change. And I think we're really now at a point where it's no longer theoretical; it's becoming right in front of us, and something we're having to deal with time and again, and will do over the years ahead. And I thought the case studies did a good job at making that clear. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we are nearing the end of today's session. There are more questions, but we've kind of run out of time, because I want to give panelists just, a minute each on how did you find the scenario? Did you find it realistic? Or are there other things that we ought to be thinking about? And let's start with Miriam.
I found it really an interesting exercise that maybe, I know it was, blunt in many ways, but that made it kind of easier to really think through what could really go wrong for companies if you don't think through. So I think something like this would be really, really useful for many people to think through. I feel bad as an investor because, to David's point, CEOs are under so much pressure to please investors for today's return, and yet we're making them think about 5, 10 years and hold them account. It's almost an impossible game. And so I think we do need to think about how the investor and company relationship develops in the face of this collective challenge. And I think we need to think about the issue of short-termism that's persistent in that relationship as well. And to think that if you don't get this right, if many, many companies are going to make mistakes like this company did, then not only financially we are in trouble, but the planet will be in trouble. So I think this is a really dire situation that we can think through to think about, well, what do we have to do as an investor to help companies transition appropriately and invest appropriately, and for us to be longer investors as well. So I think there's been a lot of learnings for me as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for taking part. Nigel.
I'd echo that. I think obviously because there's a scenario, these were rather blunt and binary decisions and perhaps not real world. But what I think it brings home is just how different the world is going to be. It's going to be a radically different place in 10 years' time because of the transition. It's going to be a very different place in 5 years' time. And so the pressures that you might not be feeling today, you'll be feeling acutely in that time. It'll be from a whole variety of stakeholders, the shareholders, regulators, of course, in the UK, rating agencies, counterparties. Will your corporate customers want to deal with you if you've got the right kind of track record in this regard? Customers, reputation, activists, and so on. All of them will have a say about this. There'll be radically more information available to them, largely as a result of TCFD, but a lot of other initiatives as well that are underway just to delve into supply chains and so on. So the companies who get out ahead of this and really do their homework in this will be much, much better placed than their competitors, their peers. And this is obviously a big issue for the boards, but also for those below them. It can't just be a board issue. That the whole company has to begin adapting to this very new world.
Yeah, no, thank you. David, any last thoughts from you?
Well, probably just back to that central dilemma of, if I can say, the level playing field. Look, no country can be sovereign in this environment. We have to collectively agree standards. Otherwise, it'll be an impossible place for boards to be. If I'm competing against a Brazilian company who is not obliged to meet any of these standards, and I'm just picking Brazil, I'm not trying to particularly pick Brazil, there are plenty of other countries I could mention. That's my number one competitor. I know I'm just simply going to put myself out of business if I go through all of these costs, because the consumer in the final analysis doesn't care enough if there's going to be a cost difference. We have a problem. So for me, it's all about these international efforts working. COP26 next November is crucial. And any idea that any country can act alone and be sovereign is a nonsense, despite what certain politicians continue to say and believe. We have a much more compelling issue, which is the future of our world and its climate.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to give the floor to Julie.
Thank you, Joe. I mean, I found this absolutely fascinating, and particularly the voting, because when we all worked on the scenario, we did wonder, I think, quite whether these questions, whether these dilemmas would really work in this context. But I thought the votes were very, very interesting. And I would end with one thought, really, which is that I think, I can't prove it, but that if we'd done this 12 months ago, we would have got a totally different response from our audience and a different set of percentages in the votes. And I recognize that a lot of our audience are Chapter Zero members, so they are inevitably going to be biased towards climate being an issue because they're already well educated. But I think that it's just very compelling to see how the agenda has moved on over the last 12 months. And if we look forward 12 months to COP next year, if we ran this again then, I think we might be amazed at how things have moved again in another 12-month period. this is not a 2100 issue anymore. This is a 2021, 22, 23 issue. And that's one of the things that came home to me from the scenario today.
Great. Well, let me just end by saying thank you to everybody for taking part. I did want to just promote that, GARP is doing a lot of things on climate risk, from formal education to research. We are supporting the regulators, and we're doing events like this, which have been fantastic. And if you want to get even more of an event like this, then you can join our event on Tuesday, which is a rerun of this. But you probably had enough. You've worked hard for the last hour and a half. Thank you all very much for taking part. And thank you to Clyde & Co for helping us put today's event together. And I hope that you've enjoyed it. Any comments, feel free to get in touch with me at jo.paisley@garp.com. But thanks again. And thanks to Julie and Chapter Zero for letting us put on today's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jo.